Today's focus, starting with Sheng, nourishing life, extending life. This term Sheng, it implies somehow, maybe you're familiar with this kind of dietary trip that had been popular for some time, macrobiotics. That's actually when George Russell created that term, he was actually translating Sheng. Like it's in some ways larger life, extended life, nourishing life, whatever. People often talk about it as longevity techniques, health maintenance. That's what this Sheng, and it was a traditional subject in Chinese medicine thought, and yet in more recent treatments of Chinese medicine in the West, it didn't, even though we said, well, Chinese medicine emphasizes prevention and stuff, what you actually study is, let's do syndrome differentiation of a patient and then treat their disorder. And there wasn't so much emphasis on Sheng until, the last few years, really. And then we started to see more interest and more translation of material in this and all, and yet it was historically an important part of Chinese medicine thought. And quite frankly, I have trouble distinguishing a lot of it from our topic yesterday of spirituality, because the overarching aspect of nourishing life is you have to have a sense of meaning and purpose for your life. That directs your Shen, and as we said yesterday, then you start to make better choices, and you're more motivated to do health practices. And even if you don't feel well, you tend to have the force of Shen. And as we said, Shen leads Qi, Qi leads blood, blood leads strength. And so if the Shen is directed, the Qi moves, goes past the obstructions, goes past the dysfunctions, the blood circulates. What we always say, blood is valued for flowing, not for stagnating. The blood circulates, the body will feel strength. So it begs the question then, if the person really has fatigue, what's modern medicine's definition of chronic fatigue? Fatigue that has lasted for at least 6 months and prevents the person from doing previously tolerated activities. Well, if your Shen is directed and it therefore guides the Qi, and the Qi is then able to go past these kinds of obstructions, you have to wonder, is it true that the person with chronic fatigue may actually have a lack many times of clear meaning and purpose, therefore, and we certainly encounter this a lot, right? People with chronic fatigue, they're in a difficult situation, they don't like their work, it's too stressful, it's not rewarding. They have an overtaxing home life where they don't feel they get the support that they need. And I always think of a favorite patient of mine with chronic fatigue, and her husband she actually had several relatively young kids, and her husband fancied himself as a mechanic, and so they had 5 or 6 cars, none of which ran very well. And so she was typically late for treatments because of car problems. And one day she came in tears, again quite late for her appointment, only to say, well, we broke down on the freeway again. And I said to her, why don't you just tell, and I had met her husband a number of times, he was a friendly enough fella, and I said, why don't you just say to him, look, we need one good, reliable car. I don't care what a mechanic you think you are, that you can buy these junkers. And it seemed so obvious. She needed my sort of pressure to help make that step, right? And just making that change, she did that, made that change. She felt so much more supported. They're like, did I need to tonify her Qi anymore? Probably not. Suddenly her life flowed better.
Sorry.
Right? So you can see this aspect of if the Shen is disturbed, you don't feel supported. Right? So in that sense, Shen does have an overlap with spiritual concerns. Having said that, though, you have it in your packet now. This page, which is a compilation of, and it's actually from a modern text dealing with Shen. It's a compilation of various issues that are considered relevant to having this expanded, nurtured life. And it's grouped into two groups. The first group is just normal living, not things that should be special or difficult, just things that you should just do as a matter of course. And so you see the first one of these is to go by the laws of yin and yang. And what does that mean? To pay attention to natural cycles and rhythms. For example, we have a daily biorhythm, and that is relative to the movement of the sun. So if we behave in some kind of regulated way in a daily behavior, that's partly going by the laws of yin and yang. And so we see this, for example, in the Neijing, talks about, how by the seasons and that we should, get up earlier or in the summer and sleep later in the winter and all. That's part of this going by the laws of yin and yang. Now, in terms of, let's say we have different rhythms. We have the daily rhythm created by the earth turning. So in regards to that, we should guide our daily activities, meaning that we should get up early. I think the principle here is that that our biorhythms are set, our behaviors are set by many generations before us. Chinese medicine believes that, in fact, we carry the Jing from 7 generations of ancestors. This is why, historically, you should, in China, always know where the graves are 7 generations back, because you're still receiving Jing from those dead ancestors, even though they're even dead, was the traditional. And by tending their graves, you got a lot of influence coming in. So if you wanted to have optimum support from your ancestors, you needed to be able to go back 7 generations. We actually see this 7 generations thing somewhat cross-culturally. You see it in Native American traditions. They talk about how we should have behaviors. Wasn't it Chief Seattle who had that famous speech where he said we should make choices thinking how it will influence 7 generations in the future? So you see it in the Native American tradition. You see it in the Judeo-Christian thing. You haven't seen this in the Bible. The sins of the fathers visited upon the sons for 7 generations, hence this kind of fire and brimstone sort of talk. Well, so there is something about this. So if it's true that our Jing has 7 generations of influence, we can't suddenly decide we're going to make a radical change from the way our parents or grandparents live. Of course, we can eat a somewhat better diet than our parents, but if our parents ate a high-protein diet, and our grandparents did, let's say you come from a Northern European ancestry, all of a sudden, you're going to do some health food regime that says, well, there's an African tribe that only eats 6 grams of protein a day and never gets cancer, so we all should do that. I always ask that person, oh, were your parents African tribesmen? It's usually some white guy, with a very pale skin and blonde hair, and he's talking about how African tribes people live on 6 grams. It's ridiculous, because, this is very easy to verify clinically. You look at who's doing well on particular health food regimes. You will see Northern European peoples tend to do much more poorly on limited protein diets than Southern European peoples. Looking out at this audience, I can see that by and large, most of us have European ancestors. And so we can look at that. We can say, well, like, I'm Italian, grew up in a very traditional Italian family. I can eat these weird health food regimes that are mostly grain-based. But you get your Dutch friend to try that. It's not likely. You get your Scandinavian friend to try. It's not likely he will do as well. Because there's these very interesting examples. Look at what's happened during World War II when in the Japanese prison camps, when they often put Chinese prisoners and Western prisoners together. The Chinese prisoners did better than the Western prisoners, eating that almost exclusively rice gruel diet. That was it. So when a person says, okay, I'm going to make a radical change, you can't do it so fast. And we want to do it right away. I'm going to do everything different than what, and in fact, our society is doing that. We're in the midst of a big social experiment. We're changing everything, If we look at the way our grandparents lived, it's quite close in many ways to the way people lived 200 years ago or 300 years ago. I had a funny example of this. We were driving through Arizona one day, and I had my mom with me. My mom's now 87, maybe 88. But she's, we were driving through Arizona, and we stopped at one of these museums of like colonial history or something, or early history of when white people got into Arizona there. And they had this wall of implements that with numbers, and you had to try to guess what they were for. And they had the typical things, the apple peeler and this and that. And I'm very enthusiastic about history and do some historical reenacting. And also, I looked at that, and I could name about what half of them did. My kids were with me. They were teenagers at that time. They looked at them. They could name just a couple of the things they did. My mom comes in. She goes, oh, blah, 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 blah. She knew every one. She goes, I've used all those things. Right? Now, this is like 250 years ago. My mom used them. That's how it was, right? But now we changed everything. We stay up later. We sleep later. We don't eat at regulated times. We've really radically changed our diet. We have totally different viewpoints about discipline of kids. All these things are in flux, but our body can't keep up because it takes 7 generations to sort of integrate those changes into the body. So this whole little digression of that is to say, when we talk about this daily biorhythm, it's a behavioral biorhythm. It's not innate. It's not in every animal. It's programmed in by generations of behavior. So we should get up early, as all agriculturalists do. They tend to get up early. And so Chinese medicine says, ideally, you should get up around 5 o'clock and do some kind of deep breathing and light exercise. The reason for that is you capitalize on the fact that the lung is active 3 to 5. And so you want to catch the end of that and take advantage of that to really cultivate your qi. In fact, this is what we see if you go live in a temple or a monastery or an ashram or something. This is when they like to do practices. They get up at it's supposed to be a spiritual place, and they get up at an ungodly hour, right? The reason being, that time you can capitalize on that biorhythm of the body. So you get up early. And then yesterday we talked about depression, and I gave that Chinese folk saying that you should get up every morning and clean your house. The best time to clean your house, there's a correspondence, macrocosm, microcosm to the inside the body. You clean your house during large intestine time. So you get up, and then you order your environment. That really harmonizes your qi. After doing things around your place and ordering an environment, that's when you have breakfast, when you've gone from large intestine to stomach time. Because now the organ of, and really you see, the stomach is active then. That's really the most important meal. People even in the West say it's breakfast. Sure, because the stomach qi is highest first thing in the morning. You eat breakfast, that should be the time you can really take in and assimilate that. Think about later. Dinner time, there is no organ of digestion active. And so if we say, oh, I'm going to make my biggest meal at dinner, that's counter to the biorhythm that's programmed into the body. Maybe 7 generations from now, people will have their stomach active in the evening. That's just, we're trying to start that program, but we've deviated from this previously programmed pattern. So, as I say, we get up, we have the cycle, and we're all familiar with it, 3 to 5 being lung, and that's the time to do qi practice. And then 5 to 7, that's the large intestine, and that's the time to do cleansing and ordering and cleaning of the environment. And then we have the stomach time, 7 to 9, that's the time to have breakfast. And then you have this interval of spleen and heart. This is considered the time, traditionally, so 9 to 11, 11 to 1, this is the time to do work. And notice the spleen being active 9 to 11, that work that requires intellectual concentration. The time you can study and remember best is during the spleen time. Right? So we're a little lucky in that way right now. You'll remember stuff from this part of the talk better than later on in the day. It's not just that you're tired, it's just that your body's physiology doesn't support it as much. This is the time when your concentration is supported by your innate biorhythm, right? And then comes small intestine, another good time to eat. So notice you have a stomach time and a small intestine time when taking in, as the small intestine separates pure and impure substances, particularly in terms of production of blood, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Small intestine is important for that. Then you have the bladder time, 3 to 5. No, you don't have to hold it until 3 to go. It's not. But actually, this is quite an interesting time, isn't it? Since organs 12 hours opposite are in that strong or weak relationship, during bladder time in the afternoon, the lung is actually at its lowest. Therefore, that's the issue of feeling tiredness in the afternoon is actually a sign of lung qi deficiency. Yeah, your qi dips because the lung is weak, and the lung being the master of qi, you're likely to experience that lag at that time. But in general, this interval is considered another good time for work. The bladder being the taiyan, the surface level, outward activity is seen as relevant at that time. But it shifts at 5 because now you move into the kidney time, and this turns to the inward. So the Shao Yin being very deep. So we go from an outward activity time in the afternoon to an inward activity time at 5. So starting somewhere around 5, you should change your behavior from outward concerns to more inward relaxation. And isn't it interesting that we do have, even in the West, with no knowledge of this, we've spontaneously sort of chosen this 9 to 5 or 8 to 6 sort of workday thing. And most people, at least a generation or two ago, around 6 o'clock, someone would typically go home and have dinner, right? But nowadays, we've tended to, especially if we're studying Chinese medicine, we do all these health practices, like have a lot of evening classes, which are totally out of balance, totally against the timing of when you remember well, and very draining to the kidney, because the kidney is nurtured by inward movement. And so if we then were to go home and relax, then we could replenish our kidney. Same thing in the wintertime. If we weren't as active in the winter, the kidney gets stronger. If we really raise our activity levels in the winter, you actually deplete the kidney because it benefits from that kind of inward movement of qi. So we have the kidney time, 5 to 7, and then it goes to pericardium. That's the time when you should have sex. 7 to 9 in the evening is the best time to have sex. Now, we had classes typically at Pacific College. Our classes would start around 6 and go 6 to 9. So I always made sure I gave a little extra break time because the students had to take care of this biorhythm thing. 7 to 9 you should be out there having sex. But because although we're calling this pericardium, it's really ministerial fire. That ministerial fire is what really provides for arousal in sexual function. And so that's the good time for that. Notice, by the way, the pericardium is strong from 7 to 9. The opposite to that, 7 to 9 in the morning, is the most common time for heart attacks. When the pericardium is weak. So it's not when the heart is weak that people get heart attacks. It's when the pericardium is weak that people get heart attacks. So that protective aspect of the pericardium, that more physicalized aspect of actual heart function is important for this. When blood stagnation really occurs in the heart, it's when the pericardium is weak. We're going to talk about heart disorders later today, and we'll look at some treatment for that. Okay, then remember you're getting up 5, so you go to bed pretty early, and so you've had sex sometime between 7 and 9. Now, if you follow Sun Tzu Miao and you have 10 partners, it's a lot to crowd them in that interval, But
But then you can't do 2-hour blocks of time, so you just got to keep.
Right. Well, see, when you said, when somebody asked that question, somebody else says 10 partners in a night really rebuilds your kidney. Doesn't it exhausting? Well, you're crowding all 10 partners into 2 hours, so it's not like you're like, this is spending so much time with each one. There's so many famous stories around this kind of stuff, and it's always, it's sort of funny, and but like, one of the emperors had so many concubines, because at that time, the emperors would have all these concubines because that was a lot of part of political alliances, right? And so they would compete with each other because everybody wanted to become his favorite. All the concubines wanted to become the emperor's favorite. And so one of the emperors actually had a little goat-drawn cart that moved on tracks. It was like a little train, and it would go past all the concubines' rooms. And he would get in the little cart, and he would let the goat go, and whichever place it stopped in front of, that was the concubine he'd be with that night. So he let the goat choose for him who was going to be his sex partner. Well, one of the concubines got quite smart about this and actually started to put food for the goat out there, so it would always stop at her place. This is actually historically fact because she did become his favorite, and very. I don't know why you would trust the judgment of this to the goat. It's just a curious thing. Anyway, so we have that interval after 9. You have the triple warmer, you have the gallbladder, you have the liver. In any case, even if you're not getting up at 5, you have to sleep during the liver interval of 1 to 3. Because if you don't, the liver doesn't get to store blood sufficiently. So you may stay up later, especially now that we have electric lights and all that, stay up later than triple warmer and gallbladder time. But if it's and the worst thing of all is to stay up through the liver time, drink alcohol, and have orgasms. Then you really damage the liver.
That's college students.
Yes, that's college students.
They wind up with mononucleosis.
Yeah, right. Oh, it's a good point you say, because mononucleosis, these guys really are liver related. There's a lot of liver stagnation in those. And as we see, the liver stagnation gets high as the liver blood gets low. The liver chi can't spread when there's no blood so we say chi moves blood, but blood creates the environment for chi to move normally also. They're interrelated in this regard. So we often see erratic movement of chi when there's no blood. In one way it can go towards wind, right? In another way it can go, I tell you, we mentioned this yesterday, but I'll reinforce it. If you have chronically swollen lymph nodes, and of course with mono, lymph node swelling is a big part. When those lymph nodes get hard, it's often insufficient to try to disperse phlegm to break them down. You have to also tonify blood. And surprisingly, herbs that support liver blood, like gochidza and baishao and stuff, really help hard lymph nodes for that reason. The blood softens and allows that movement to occur again. So, and also we said yesterday, the liver blood supports the wei qi. So it's not just the lung that supports. The lung is more the qi level of wei qi support, but the liver blood supports the wei qi. If there's no liver blood, the wei qi collapses inward.
Another interesting thing about this cycle, at heart time, if you read the very ancient text, it's a time to stop whatever you're doing and calibrate yourself to your destiny, to your highest dreams. So
Yes.
that the Sheng stays active.
Yes, that's.
And that's a part of why people lose that. They don't stop. And that the praying in Mecca is calibrated to this cycle.
Oh, Well, her comment about the heart time is a good time to calibrate the Shen towards your destiny. Your destiny, we talked about this yesterday when Confucius said, Wu shi zhi tian ming, and when you're 50, you know heaven's destiny. That takes always a certain level of self-reflection. Yesterday, when we drew that diagram of how Chinese medicine sees the mind, where there's sort of a conscious level of which we're aware of, and a below conscious level, a more subtle level, where all the seeds of behavior are located. I also said there's another part, an observer considered here, where you have mindfulness to watch what's going on in the cosmic mind. This is cultivated by self-reflection, and that's a part of Yangshen. The fact that you actually do look at yourself, pay some attention. But this is a tricky concept, because on the other side of that, over-attention to your physicality, to your sensations and stuff, actually blocks chi. So we want to think in terms of, having our spiritual perspective. Do I have a direction in life? Do I have goals that I feel are positive and I want to actualize? And at the same time, we don't want to go to the other extreme, where we often see with patients, they become so self-analyzing and watching every sensation and every movement. That actually becomes counterproductive. So to hit that mean between those, where we have reflection on what am I doing and is it supporting me and how, that's a good thing. But I don't want to be like, oh, I feel this and I feel that, and oh, this affected me that way. And it becomes, so we have to find that balance. And it's so easy in these discussions of Yangshen to fall into the trap of over-analysis of sensation and over-analysis of behavior, that it becomes so counterproductive. We particularly see that, as I say, this list, as we're going through it, has these sort of things you regularly do, but then it has all these special techniques. If you were to attempt to do all of these special techniques in their most elaborate forms, your life would end up miserable instead of nurtured, and we'd certainly see patients fall into this trap, where and then they say all those ridiculous things, like, oh, I'm now doing all these health practices, so I'm a lot healthier than I used to be, therefore I can't do, and I can't experience. We see it with people on diet regimes a lot. Oh, now that I'm eating healthy, I can't even have a little bit of that, or it totally throws me out of whack. That's not correct. And people get irritated with me as I mention this in lectures, because you often have people that are really on their rigid regimes. But what happens if you follow regimes so rigidly that your buffering mechanisms of your body get weakened? You suddenly become overly sensitive. Whereas a truly healthy person can experience greater extremes without it destabilizing their body. So the healthier you get, the more I'm not saying you should do it all the time. Eventually your body would get damaged by that. But a healthy person should be able to visit their mother and eat her Thanksgiving cooking without it upsetting totally their homeostasis. But so often we have people, oh, I'm on this special diet, it's made me so healthy, but I can't go home, I can't even, my mother cooks, she uses canned vegetables, oh, she uses butter and that. So what? If you're really healthy, right? So we really have to find that kind of balance in how we're going to apply Yangshen to this. Anyway, we had that issue of the daily biorhythm. We have the lunar biorhythm giving us our monthly cycle. This affects both men and women. Men have a monthly cycle. You can track hormonal changes from modern biomedicine. It's more important in women because the moon is the emblem of yin and more affects blood level of things. The sun is the emblem of yang and more affects chi level. So some practitioners would argue that this daily biorhythm is more important for your male patients and the monthly biorhythm is more important for your female patients. In that regard, then, for women, observing their menstrual cycling as it relates to the lunar movement is revealing. If the menstruation falls closer to the new moon, the woman is more likely to be dealing with issues relative to excess in the body. If her menstruation falls closer to the new moon, she's dealing more with issues relative to deficiency. And you then sometimes see a sudden shift. And that would be very meaningful. If somebody was generally cycling closer to the new moon and all of a sudden skipped their period for 2 weeks and then it came, something we do hear these stories, oh, something's changed. She was deficient because she always had her menstruation. Now, it's not going to, of course, it's not, Chinese medicine says the normal interval of cycle is 25 to 33 days for menstruation. So you get that window. and the moon takes, 29 and a half days or something. So it's never perfectly timed, but still we look, is it closer to one or the other? And so if this woman was generally cycling so that her period fell closer to the new moon and then suddenly shifted, oh, her deficiency has now caused excess, stagnation of blood or stagnation of chi or something like that. The deficiency has now turned to heat, like an empty heat. Some shift has occurred that would create that. And so we can't say that one is better than the other. There's no historical emphasis on that. We do see some modern teachers say that, oh, it'd be better if all women cycled closer to the new moon. You see this sometimes. That's like saying it'd be better if all women were a little more deficient than the excess. If you ask me, I'd go to the other side. I'd always rather patients be a little more excess than deficient, because excess people are more interested, right? You see, most modern views of health, because you always look, counseling about health practices are usually always in reaction to the general society situation. And because our society tips towards excess, we overeat, we overwork, we have so high calorie diets, we get a lot of excess problems of food retention and phlegm damp accumulation, and then we have all this behavioral stuff that generates fire in the body. Because of, you see, the counterbalancing health practices often go towards deficiency. And so a lot of the recommendations are trying to make you more deficient to balance the general excess of the, you hear these crazy things like the raw fooders who say, oh, women, if they would follow this raw foods diet, will stop menstruating because their body is so clean. No, it's not. They're blood deficient now. It's not a health practice, but this is a commonly taught thing in raw food diet presentations, right? So they like to move the person, and then they say these other things like, if you follow this or that health regime, you will become so clean inside that you have no body odor, even if you don't bathe. Only cold deficient people are like that. I like people that are hot and stink, because they're really interesting. They're active. They do things. They're not like home, like I can't do anything because I have no energy. So
that's closer to your ancestry.
It's closer to my ancestry.
Yeah, so you would.
Yeah, I would like. Yesterday we talked about this. You always have to die. Anything that a teacher says is their delusion because of their nature, what appeals to them. So you always have to diagnose me. So I'm who I am, and so what appeals to me and what feels right then as a clinical judgment is going to be biased by that. I mentioned yesterday my old Korean mentor. I mean, when I was apprenticing with him, he was in his 70s, and I always knew at that part of the day when I saw his hand go to his back as he walked to the next patient, there was only going to be deficiency diagnoses from there on out that day. Right? Because that's what he needed. And so that filter went up. And this is what we all do clinically, right? We tend to filter. Since we say in Chinese medicine, the practitioner is the diagnostic instrument, then our instrument is calibrated according to our situation. And that's where the more balanced what does it say in the Jing, the Pulse Classic? Because the practitioner has well-regulated breathing, you can time the patient's pulse according to your breath. Modern practitioners are screwy about this. They try to time the patient's pulse according to the patient's breath. Why? Because they know they don't have well-regulated breathing. But we should. We should have, our breathing should be like clockwork. It actually takes practice, doesn't it? Because we have to practice watching our breath and not making it slower and slower. Otherwise, every patient has a heart disorder. Because as you start to watch your breath and count their pulse, your breathing gets slower, and their pulse is so many beats per breath. Well, but if you really have well-regulated breathing, you can use it as a timing mechanism. So the practitioner, as an accurate diagnostic instrument, needs to be somewhat balanced. And I find, okay, we don't have to be physically perfect, but if we have our Sheng in that state of openness and acceptance of the patient and not being judgmental and so forth, we can often empathize and hear their experience and not put the overlay of our own diagnosis on top of it. But you know, those days in the clinic when every patient you seem to diagnose liver chi stagnation, you need to step back and say, is that really them, or am I starting to diagnose myself all the time? You know, and anyhow, I certainly know that happens. You know, you go in and you're a little bit got that wind heat thing cropping up, but not bad enough. You're going to cancel your patients that day. Nobody needs moxa that day. Have you noticed that? That acrid smoke thing, that can't be good for anybody, right? Stand. Anyhow, so we have this cycle. In your packet, I know I put the. We discussed it yesterday, but I put the monthly cycle rhythm here for women, and it's become so popular these days to treat based on stage of the menstrual cycle. This is a relatively modern idea, but it's become very dominant. I've studied with a lot of teachers in China who use this method, and there are various ways to do it. One method, which I find very appealing, is to make a general diagnosis of your female patient and prescribe treatment based on that. So whatever she has, based on her symptoms and signs, you do your treatment, whether it's herbs or acupuncture or whatever. But then you do a secondary analysis of her menstrual cycle, and if there is a particular point in her menstrual cycle where she has symptomology, you then do an intervention at that moment as well, changing your treatment. So for example, you have a patient who comes in with whatever complaint it is, digestive upsets or orthopedic pain or whatever, and you're treating that. But she also tells you, you know, I have sleeplessness at a certain time of the month, or I have PMS with cramping at a certain interval before my period, or, oh, I have headaches during the time I'm having menstrual bleeding. Whatever that is, you actually change from your standard diagnosis, oh, you're spleen chi deficient, oh, you have stagnation of chi and blood due to cold, whatever your complaint was. You then focus on that, and in doing that, you harmonize the menstrual cycle. You're actually harmonizing her monthly rhythm, and that will support whatever other thing that's going on. So I find this a very useful thing to do with female patients. You're sort of treating in a, you know, it's like we talked about yesterday with disorders like insomnia or whatever, how if you set the environment right in the body, then your particular focus treatment becomes more effective. So if you had the patient with insomnia and you wanted to reconnect the heart and kidney or bring down liver fire or whatever, we said, oh, but if they don't have relaxation of the neck and shoulders, there's a blockage there, the yang can't descend. You have to make the right environment. The same thing in general for a female body, because it's so influenced by this monthly rhythm, and we have this blood cycle going on. If we treat them and then also make the right environment by making their blood cycle normal, everything just responds better. So that's a very a nice way of using this method of generally treating your patient and just doing an extra focused intervention if there is a symptomatic issue that goes on with their menstruation.
Do you just do that intervention during the time they experience it in the cycle, or do you just incorporate that into your treatments all the time?
No, you would focus on it at that time, but it's not just when they feel the symptom. For example, if they say, oh, it's PMS that shows up mostly, you know, all those menstrual movement disorders that occur. Okay, it's PMS that shows up, you know, 3 days or 5 days before my actual bleeding begins, and it shows up as crampiness, headaches, irritability, whatever, you know, it is. You could actually anticipate that by a few days to actually already get the chi moving before. So you don't have to wait till the symptoms appear. But you don't treat that the whole month or incorporate that. You just can focus on that at that particular time. That is one way of using this different segments method. And it's a way I like when a patient comes in with chief complaints other than menstrual issues. If, on the other hand, the person just wants to do health. They're asymptomatic in general. They just want to support health. You know, it's Sheng, right? They just want to support health. Of course, you can do another method of just doing bi-monthly treatment, where you treat in the two halves of the cycle, giving blood building in the first half, giving qi and blood moving in the second half. This is sort of a health maintenance strategy then for this. So so if we're going to use this method, let me get my you know what a lot of people do. Page go here. Sorry. Thought I was organized, but you know, only so much I can manage with my disorderly mind. Ah, here we go. It's not so clear. You can see this is a typical herbal version of treatment following a half the month one, half the month the other. You can use Arjuwan, a more yin-oriented formula, and you start on the 5th day of menstrual bleeding and you continue that for 10 days. Basically, you're continuing to when normal ovulation would occur. And we can supplement both of these two formulas by adding Xiang Fu, often called the women's friend, a kind of softening herb for the liver, but not overly dispersing, quite safe in no matter what else is going on. So you can always add Xiang Fu, and you can add Suwutang, the four substances to build blood into both of these formulas. So, you know, Arjuwan and Arshiantang are quite simple formulas. We can make them a little more nurturing by adding Xiang Fu and Suwutang. And so you have this cycle from the 5th day of menstrual bleeding out for 10 days. They do the yin formula, the Arjuwan, and then switch to the Arshiantang, the more yang formula, and take that for 11 days. And then you stop. Then menstrual bleeding occurs on the 5th day. And this is something you could just cycle regularly. So now if you were using point therapy instead of herbal therapy, you would say, oh, I'm going to choose a blood tonic prescription for this half of the cycle, and I'm going to use a more moving prescription of points in this half of the cycle. And we're going to look at that in just a minute of how to use points to actually facilitate this. So that's another way of doing this monthly cycle thing. If it's just maintenance, just divided into two phases. There's one third aspect to this monthly cycling thing, and that is if the person really wants to focus on regulating menstruation. There's two reasons. One is the menstrual cycle is symptomatic in some way. The other is that the menstrual cycle it needs to be developed for fertility. Perhaps this is an older woman who's now trying to get pregnant and really wants to enhance fertility, enhance their chances. In that case, you could actually treat methodically through the cycle at each stage. So what you do there is a little more elaborate. Let me put up. In this first phase, again, starting about the 5th day of bleeding, this is telling you Chinese medicine feels that 5 days of bleeding is normal. And so by then, the bleeding should be tapering down, so it's safe to start to do tonification again. If you tonify through the actual time of bleeding, you can actually make more blood come out, and the person feels weaker instead of built up by that. So if you are going to give tonics during the menstrual bleeding, you have to also give hemostatics. Now that can come in two forms. The hemostatics can be spleen tonics, because the spleen will then hold the blood in. They can also be hemostatic type herbs. For example, a very popular one is to use the san qi. We mentioned yesterday it can be given after birth for the same reason. It keeps blood moving, but it's not excessively. It's not gonna move it out. It holds it in. So it's both hemostatic and moving, because you don't want to stop the bleeding. You just don't want more blood to come out. So an herb like san qi is good, or an herb like puhong, cattail pollen is pretty regulated in that way. It's not overly hemostatic, and yet it won't let the blood come out. It's, you know, if you want to go with something like burnt hair or something, that's more stop bleeding. Really helpful during pregnancy when you have a problem there. See, if your significant other had bleeding, you know, you better sprout some hair. But then it's saying, right, if you should never get pregnant with a man with no
You
hair.
might have it other ways. Can't you use it other places?
No, that's the problem.
Okay.
You can't use chest hair, you can't use arm hair, forget about pubic hair. You can't use those things for stop bleeding, because bleeding out of the bottom, you need the excess of blood that comes out of the top. That's the doctrine of signatures here. And so, and generally anybody's hair works for this. But there is the feeling that during pregnancy, the hair of the baby's dad is the most powerful to stop breakthrough bleeding. So what you do, if you're a woman and you have breakthrough bleeding occur during the pregnancy, you cut some hair off the dad. The way to actually prepare this, you put it in a little bit of aluminum foil, put it in the toaster oven. Turn the toaster oven on, and it stinks because the hair starts to turn to ash in there. When the stink starts to go down, you open up the aluminum foil, and it's turned to like ash in there. You mix that in some water and drink it. About a half teaspoon mixed in a little water 2 or 3 times a day, and it's remarkably effective. So it's
how
good.
do you know?
First aid, huh?
How do you know that?
Oh, I recommend it in you know, I do a lot of treatment during pregnancy because a lot of practitioners are nervous about that, which is unfortunate. And that's a whole other issue. But just say suffice for this, I was picking on you, just teasing. But that's what they say, right? That you want the head hair because it's the opposite direction. It's the excess of blood going up, and so when the blood is leaking out, it's astringing that in.
So
Anyway.
conversely, to help grow head hair, would you drink pubic hair? We can
A
have
whole,
tonic here that
whole
could-
new therapy has been developed in the lecture. I can see Andrew backing up the tape right now. We want to
We're going
edit.
to edit this out.
We want to edit that comment out. Anyway, so the important principle, though, is starting on the 5th day of menstrual bleeding, you start giving tonic treatment. And then, just previous to when, so it would be about 10, really I would say probably about 8 days of tonic treatment, or maybe even just a week of tonic treatment. So you have to make this work out in a clinical way, right? If you're going to see the person, say, on a weekly basis, so that you can actually regulate at each stage of the cycle, you've got to kind of make the timing work out. So you start sometime towards the end of menstrual bleeding, you go a week of tonification. You can give her a week of tonic herbs to take at home, or your point prescription in that treatment is more tonic to qi and blood. And then comes, you want to facilitate ovulation. And this actually requires 2 things. It requires that you have Jing in the kidney, because ovulation cannot occur if there's no Jing. So supplementing Jing is a difficult thing to do. If the person really, and what they often come in diagnosed with is the Western gynecologist says, oh, they have no eggs left. No eggs left. You hear this kind of diagnosis, right? In that case, you actually need to give real nourishing treatment. Usually, I think, you have to give animal substances to that person. If there's no eggs left and you think, I might still be able to, and in fact, you will have results in some of these patients. But here, you really have to give all of the turtle shells and deer antlers, and you can give placenta and all of those kind of deeply nourishing animal substances to try to revive their Jing. This is a good time to do it. Focus on the kidney and give those kind of. If the person's a vegetarian, I don't know what to say about that. You know, it's just hard to replenish that kind of Jing. More often, though, the problem is there's no yang to produce the ovulation, and or the pathway is blocked. There's that thing called the uterus lomi, right? I should put uterus here. The uterus lomi connects the kidney to the uterus. It's how the Jing gets from the kidney to make the blood in the uterus fertile. It's really like the chi level of the fallopian tube, isn't it? And so if the lomi is blocked, you're likely to hear symptoms such as mid-cycle pain. The woman says, oh, around ovulation, I feel a little discomfort or pain or something like that. That's blockage in that uterus lomi. With acupuncture, the main point for that is the abdomen zigong point. That opens the uterus lomi. You also want to do warming, like with moxa, because the lomi is a small vessel and needs to be expanded by heat. Even when the cause might have been previous pelvic inflammatory disease or whatever, still to facilitate the actual movement of the Jing. And then you need the yang to push the Jing forward. This is why we find kidney yang tonics actually facilitate ovulation. For example, all of your kidney yang tonic herbs, Shu Duan, I think, is maybe the most famous one. Shu Duan is said to be an herb that really triggers ovulation. It has a very hormonal-like effect in its action on the body. If you again with points, you're going to do all that stuff that raises kidney yang, moxa on do 4, and maybe moxa on kidney 2, and those kind of things that really give the force of kidney yang to push that. And this yang that drives the Jing forward is actually causes the spike in basal body temperature. What you actually see with ovulation is there's a little dip in basal body temperature and then the spike. The dip in body temperature is actually the Jing entering. The spike is the kidney yang behind it that made it move. So in anticipation of ovulation, our concerns are making sure there's enough Jing, making sure there's enough kidney yang to push the ovulation, making sure the lomi are open. By the way, herbally, guager, cinnamon twig, is really the main herb for opening the uterus lomi. So, for example, we have an herbal formula, xiaozhenjiang tang, often said to be in kids, it improves their constitution, it lights the kidney fire under the spleen again. When you get a kid who's not growing, little, pale, cold, inactive, that kind of appearance, xiaozhenjiang tang is the right formula. It's a little warm, it's got malt in it, and actually tastes good. Kids will take it easily. And it relights the kidney fire back under the spleen. And the main herb is the guager for that. And then there's malt in there, which makes sure it gets to the spleen. Yeah.
So then in the case with ovulation, when it's like PCOS, like polycystic ovarian syndrome, which I guess I viewed as more spleen related because of like that lack of transformation and transportation, would you then kind of, or do you view it
Well,
that
if you
way,
think there's like POS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, you actually, instead of xiaozhenjiang tang, which is more tonic, you still want to use the guager. You use guager fuling wan. Guager fuling wan is a moving formula, good for obstructions and stuff, and it also, the fuling helps the sort of fluidy cysts of the ovary, but it's more, as I say, it's more discharging rather than more tonifying.
Right. I guess I was thinking in my head, I was always thinking it was more ovulation as more of a spleen thing than a kidney. So this is good. It's just, and I think that was part of my conversation of why it was because of that disorder.
Yeah. See, no,
I
I see the now, maybe for a particular patient you can look,
Right.
but in general, I think we can see ovulation as we talk about the liver blood in this phase is getting stored in the uterus, and then that blood has to become fertile, and that depends on the Jing of the kidney reaching there. So.
Right.
It's really that. There actually is a little bit of heart involvement. there actually is some spleen involvement because this pathway, when we talk about the uterus lomi, it's actually a branch of the Chongmai. And the Chongmai, of course, we know how spleen related it is. The confluent point is spleen 4. So all these organs have impact, but fundamentally it's more the kidney in that way. And so you have two herbal, and you might think about that even in terms of point selection. Do I want to do this strictly with tonifying points? That would be your Xiaojianzhangtang approach. Or do I want to do a little more dispersing to open up the fallopian tubes, if you will? Maybe there's scarring there and stuff like that. And in that case, I choose. But for example, how about this prescription? I seem to be talking about electric stim a lot. Well, maybe because it's not used so often, so I want to give something that you might not generally consider. But if you take spleen 4, and connect electric stim from spleen 4 to Ren 3 on one side and spleen 4 to Ren 4 on the other. Doesn't matter which side goes to which. This is a strong Chongmai opening treatment. And it will really help if there's all that like scarring and stuff in there, or if there's endometriosis, for example, and you have a lot of endometrial tissue blocking things up. I use this kind of treatment for, sometimes you'll see a patient with stagnation in the lower warmer who's also getting a lot of pain syndrome, like lower back pain, sciatic pain and such, and you could find all that, and then those pain things cycle with their period. Oh yeah, my sciatic pain really flares up premenstrually or in the first few days of menstrual bleeding. That's a real sign that the stagnation is more in that reproductive area, and then it's blocking the qi as it moves down the channels of the leg. The Western guys say, oh, what really happened is endometrial tissue is wrapped around the sciatic nerve. And so then as the cycle goes, the endometrial tissue swells and compresses the nerves. Right? So from our side, we're saying it's stagnation of qi and blood. They're saying it's actually this misplaced tissue in the body. The endometrial tissue has migrated and deposited itself around the nerve pathways. So in that case, this kind of treatment. And then for the same reason, this treatment is very good for uterine fibroids. If we were to, I've got a little diagram here. I found this nice picture in a book of different uterine fibroids. And I show you this because sometimes a patient will have had ultrasound and have a sense of the type of fibroid they have. We have 3 basic locations. We have those that are on the inner surface, as they say, submucous type fiber. Some of them are this pedunculated, meaning they hang off. Some are like this, just on the wall. These are the easiest. If they know that this is the location, even if it's big, grapefruits, it doesn't matter, because this tissue is really changing a lot. We also have those that are within the muscle itself. Like you see in here, they're in the muscle. But these types that move all the way to the outside wall are the most difficult, even if they're small. There's less exchange of tissue there. It's harder to move qi and blood. So this is just a helpful bit of information to keep in mind in terms of prognosis. If the patient comes in with fibroids, it's not how big the fibroid is, it's where it's located that's going to guide whether you get easy result or not. So don't be shy of bringing this. Oh, I have a really big uterine fibroid. No problem. If it's in the right location, you get movement going like that with the Chongmai. Get your electric stim going on spleen 4, run it up to Ren 3, because after all, the Chongmai touches the Renmai at those points. So you're really taking advantage of that. And that can really create lots of movement. Okay, let's assume that enough blood entered the uterus, so the uterine lining thickened. There was enough Jing in the kidney, and there was enough kidney yang to push that Jing, and there was an open lomi so that the Jing could actually move into the liver blood, it now becomes fertile. You move past into the next phase. Either you get pregnant or you don't. If you get pregnant, something important has to happen. The liver qi has to become blocked. Because if it doesn't, you continue along this normal pathway of the menstrual cycle. Therefore, we say the first change in a woman at the moment of conception is her liver qi stagnates. Has to be. Therefore, if a woman tells you, I knew I got pregnant, I knew that day it happened, I could feel a change, she is self-diagnosing as having liver qi stagnation. Because she shouldn't be able to feel that subtle change yet. But if she already has liver qi stagnation, and then it increases even that little bit, she will be sensitive to that change. And that then is a warning that she is more likely to develop things like morning sickness as she moves forward, because the big cause for morning sickness is liver qi overacting on stomach. This is, now you understand, when we looked yesterday at the cycles of life, the first thing that happens in embryological development is the activation of the child's liver. The mother's liver becomes blocked to hold in the menstruation, to hold in the fertile blood, the now fertilized blood, in fact. And then that increase in liver triggers the embryological development of the child. So liver is the first organ activated in the child's embryology. So, right, that's what. So if the liver becomes blocked because ovulation occurs, and what causes the liver to be blocked? The Jing that has accumulated there is yin stuff, and so it prevents movement from occurring. And now what happened? The kidney yang pushed the Jing forward. If you don't get pregnant, the kidney yang keeps pushing. If you do get pregnant, the kidney yang is blocked, the liver doesn't move, and actually heat builds up in the lower warmer, providing a place for the baby to develop. So how about a patient who comes in and tells you, you know, I have PMS 2 weeks out of the month. It's not an uncommon statement. It's not really PMS in the sense of premenstrual, normally PMS is premenstrual movement problems. No movement should be occurring. That patient is having difficulty with the fact that yang is increasing after ovulation. This pressure to move things. And so they're actually saying, I have heat or I have yin deficiency. So when a patient tells you, a female patient tells you, I have PMS half the month, most likely they either have true heat or empty heat due to yin deficiency. But later, if they start to have PMS 4 or 5 days before the bleeding, okay, now this is obstruction, usually qi stagnation. This makes sense? So what we would do is after ovulation, if the person has no symptoms, they have ovulation, they feel fine, you're basically, and they're not pregnant, and you're just trying to do supportive treatment, you're basically supporting the increase of yang in the lower warmer. Moxa on the lower warmer, moxa on the lower back, kidney yang tonic points, kidney 2 and 7 perhaps, that kind of thing is helpful for her. It just supports what normally is going on. And then 4 or 5 days before the period, you could shift to a moving treatment. Give liver qi regulation, whether you want to use the 4 gates, whether you want to include liver 8, liver 14, these kind of points, whether you want to use a Xiaoyao-san kind of herb formula that moves liver qi. That's the right thing to do to just facilitate the normal cycling. And then once the bleeding occurs, if there's no symptoms, you can just have a break from treatment during the time of bleeding until the 5th day when you start building blood again. So this is Yang Sheng now of really focusing on making the menstrual cycle function in its most normal way to really increase fertility and increase then the Jing available to the baby. So it's really Yang Sheng for the baby if they're trying to move forward to pregnancy. You know, I mean, it really begs the question: how much of this do we do in the woman who's going to do IVF, where they're actually going to intervene and stop her normal cycle and then take over it with hormonal manipulation? I struggle clinically with knowing how much benefit there is to try to impose some kind of normal cycling in that circumstance, you know. So instead, I tend to do a lot more general qi regulating in that kind of patient, because the symptomology they get is a lot of qi stagnation discomfort. So, but in a person who's doing it naturally on their own, then we can really try to impose this orderly cycle. So now this was so we were talking about a daily biorhythm. We also have this monthly biorhythm. And of course, we can even use both the daily and monthly biorhythm in terms of treatment choices. Treating at certain times of day, you know, like for example, if you have a patient with weak stomach qi, you could have them moxa stomach 36 at home during the stomach time, capitalizing. And our rule is you can either do a kind of a mild treatment during the actual time, or if you're going to do strong tonification, you do it in the interval after the time, which is kind of interesting. The idea being, if there's a peak already in the stomach at 7 to 9, no use trying to build it up even more then. Wait till it's already starting to go down in the next interval and build it up again. That's even more tonic. So maybe even better, moxa stomach 36, 9 to 11 during the spleen time, and you really capitalize on that interval. So that's a way of it. And then the same thing, it's actually, in any patient, male or female, you can take the monthly biorhythm, and it's easier to tonify as you're moving towards the full moon, where it's easier to sedate as you're moving towards the new moon. And so you could actually change the intensity of your treatment following the lunar cycle in that way. So now we've talked about 2 of the cycles. Of course, there's the 3rd cycle. We had one is caused by the Earth turning. Macrocosm, microcosm is important. So the Earth turning produces the daily biorhythm. The moon is going around the Earth. That's producing the monthly biorhythm. Now the Earth is going around the sun. This is producing your yearly biorhythm, given your seasonal effects. So when we talk about, Yang Shen says, follow the laws of yin and yang, these are the 3 main cycles that we can go ad nauseum with this and talk about all of the Chinese astrology cycles, right? There's so many of them, but these are the 3 main ones. It's the Earth turning, the moon going around the Earth going around the sun. I mean, if you're interested in that Chinese astrology, if we have time at the end of the day, I'll share a little of that stuff too. You could see, how for any given year, based on which animal and element and stuff, you can know something about your physiology based on that. Anyhow, we'll take a break for a few